Let's have a look at where people all sit. We've got one attendee who knows next to nothing about xAPI and they're here to discover more. Perfect. A couple of people have got access to Learning Locker and would like to better understand how it works. Makes sense. And one person doesn't have access to Learning Locker, but they're thinking about it. Wonderful. I would suggest a caveat for anybody that's really truly getting started with xAPI. This webinar today, I would say, is part 3 of maybe a 5-part series that is progressive. So whilst I think it will be of use to you, whilst it may certainly open your eyes up to some things that you've not been aware of, the real introductory part of it was a couple of weeks ago. But fear not, because once this cycle is over, we'll repeat this cycle and we'll keep repeating it. So you've always got the chance to come back and take part in one of the more introductory new starter 101 sorts of levels. And I can see, Joe, I know that was kind of aimed at you because I know that's where you said you were, and that's absolutely fine. I still think you're going to get something out of this, even if it's just understanding, the sorts of things that you might be able to show in Learning Locker. So I am recording this session. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to formally introduce Andrew and ask him if he would take a few moments to just introduce himself whilst the slides are loading. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Greg. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, audio's good for me, Andrew.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm the lead developer on Learning Locker. I've worked on it for about a year and a half now. This is the 2nd version, and we're hoping to go open source later this year. So anybody that's on V1, going to have a fun migration coming up soon.
Thank you. And you will, of course, be hearing from Andrew a lot more in a few minutes' time, as he's really going to take the reins of this webinar once we get into the main meat of it. Let me just remind you all what we're going to cover in today's session. We're going to look at how to add a dashboard to your Learning Locker. We're going to add some widgets to that dashboard. We're then going to have a look at how that dashboard that you've created can be embedded outside of Learning Locker. And that's a relatively new feature, and it's quite a cool feature. So Andrew's going to spend a little bit of time showing us how that would work. Towards the end of the session, if we get time, we're going to have a look at the online help center to help you find out more about Learning Locker, xAPI, and be able to ask questions. If we don't get time, you will still be getting a link at the end of this session to go and have a look anyway. And at the very end, I'm going to give you the opportunity to download a few resources. I'm going to signpost you towards a few external sites for you to further your understanding, yes, of Learning Locker, but also of xAPI generally. So we're going to signpost you in a few directions for some suggested reading and a few things to have a look at. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew imminently. Just remember, he's going to show us how to add a dashboard to your Learning Locker. We're going to add some widgets to that dashboard, and then he's going to show us how those dashboards can be embedded outside of Learning Locker. If you weren't expecting to cover this in today's session, then one of us is in the wrong place. And I really hope it's you, otherwise I've got significant egg on my face if I'm delivering the wrong session along with Andrew. Before we dive into before I hand over to Andrew, let me just add some context for you. In the first session that you may or may not have attended, we talked about some language that's used when we're talking about xAPI and learning record stores. We looked at some language and terminology. We also looked at the raw data that's flowing into Learning Locker. In the second webinar, which was the previous one, we looked at how you can take that raw data and do cool stuff with it. That's as technical as I get, I promise. Cool stuff with it to build some visualizations, some graphs, some displays of information that make it easy to understand. And that's the point where we left off last time. Andrew's now going to show us what we can do and how we can display those cool looking graphs that we've created. So Andrew, I'm going to do the usual changing of the screen layout. I'm going to mute my microphone and I'm going to hand over to you.
All right. So you should be seeing Learning Locker. I'll go over quickly some of the things we covered in the last couple of sessions just to get everybody up to speed. So I've set up a demo instance of LL. I've put some data in it from a fake sales organization called Acorn Corp. This data tracks the training of salespeople from when they join the company to when they complete their training, they make some calls, and eventually they sell some things. They generate leads. If we click on a specific person, filter it down to Juan Morales there, he's done a lot of calls. But at the end of that, he's managed to create some leads with a company. I can see there's a message there, but I click on the chat panel, it's not displaying it. So if it's something important, do you want to read that out to me, Craig?
Yeah, no worries, we'll do. I'll feed any questions that are coming into the chat panel, so you feel free to just crack on with the demo.
All right, thanks. Last week we took some of that data and made it into visualizations. So for example, we wanted to see how many calls each of our salespeople made. We've got a record of every time they make a call, so we can break that down. And we've put Ben Chin at the top of the leaderboard. We wanted to see which of the courses were most popular, how people scored on each of the courses, which ones are easiest to complete, which ones people had trouble with, and a few other things. Who was the most performant salesperson, made the most calls, created the most leads. One thing we didn't cover last week was correlation graphs, so X versus Y visualizations, which let you display how somebody's doing in one area versus how they're doing in another area. So we'll go over that quickly, see if we can get any conclusions out of this data. So previously, we've used this to look at things like engagement versus performance. So how often people log into the UI, how often they try and take courses, how often they open pieces of content, versus how they score in courses. We've looked at it in terms of social learning versus performance, so how often people comment, how often they upvote other people's comments, how often they interact with other people on the course, and how that compares to the final output. But here we've just got sales data, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my x-axis. I'm going to make this the number of leads that they've created. So I'm interested in lead creation statements. That's the thing I want to count. So I'm going to pick a total unique number of statements. I'm going to filter that down to only be statements where they've created a lead. So here I've got 12, very top end, that's one, and he's made 12 leads in his time at Acorn Corp. If I want to compare that against something, so I want to see if there's some correlation between the number of calls that people make and the amount of leads they manage to generate. Again, I want to look at the number of statements, and I want to filter this to only look at specific statements. I want to see called statements. So now we've filtered the y-axis to only show calls, the x-axis to show leads. If there was a really strong correlation, you'd expect to see these dots running a line up the middle. So for every change in calls made, there's an equal change in number of leads created. What we actually see is that there's not that strong a correlation. Juan, our strongest performer here in terms of leads, actually isn't that high in terms of calls. He's an efficient caller. For X amount of calls, he makes a lot of leads. Whereas Ben Chin over here is really spamming people. but he's not converting those into actual sales. So that's not maybe what we would have expected to see, but we can draw insight from that anyway. What we can also do is add more series to this graph. So at the moment, we're showing every single person in the organization as a yellow dot. We can split that up a bit if we want to see how people perform in comparison with each other. So I'm going to add another series. I'm going to make series 1 all of the guys. And series 2 all of the girls. Well, there's not a whole lot of data here to draw conclusions from, but you can see that the girls, because they've got another series, now have a slightly different color. So you might use this to compare two departments in your organization or two different teams. We've only got the one team, so I'm just splitting them up by gender. But off this very small set, you can see there's really not much difference between men and women, as you might expect. So we'll call this goals versus performance. All right, so we've built a bunch of visualizations, and now we want to use them somewhere. So just delete this to show you what you get. When you don't have any dashboards, you get the no dashboard screen. Click the little plus button to add one and give it a name. Sales dashboard as I was before. Onto this, we add widgets. So click this little add widget button here, and we get a new widget. Change the widget settings. We choose a visualization. We'll add that calls versus performance graph that we just made. So this now appears on the dashboard, and I can use this handle in the bottom right to resize it. It'll snap to the grid at some points. So it's fairly easy. Add another widget. I'll appear somewhere below. I'll choose a different graph. We'll call this the total number of leads. If I want to move these around, there's a little area at the top, just below the handle, for dragging. Stick that there. I'll add as many widgets as I like. I'll just add a few more from the visualizations we made before. I'll add one more. All right. So at a glance, this gives us a quick overview of what's happening in our organization. We've got who's doing the most stuff, the total number of leads we've managed to create in the last 6 months, and a general activity over time. It started off recently because I haven't put any new statements in. This is just all the test data I've generated before. Now, this is great if you can log into Learning Locker. So if you're an admin or you've given a login to somebody else, some other administrator. But usually what you'll want to do is embed this somewhere. I'm going to click on the little share button here. This gives me a link which I can give around to anybody I like. At the moment, this should say forbidden. It should fail. So that says not authorized because it's selected to be viewed nowhere. You can turn these on or off after you've passed the link out fairly easily. I'm going to toggle that to anywhere, so this should display for me now. There we go. So this has stripped away all of the admin section of Learning Locker and just leaves us with the data. Can't be edited, can only be viewed, but you can still dive in and get the tooltips, get a bit more information off it. It's good to just be sent as a link. You can also embed this in an iframe if you have an existing website where you want to use one of the dashboards. If you're using it in an iframe, you also have the option for setting a specific domain. So you pick only where I choose and then type it in. If you've got multiple, you can separate them with a comma and a space. So what this would do is if I embedded this dashboard into the ht2labs.com website in an iframe, it would be visible for anybody that loaded that website. If I just had the link, it wouldn't be visible.
Andrew, if I could just, whilst you're on this particular point here, I've had a question coming from Joe, if you don't mind me firing it at you.
Yep, sure.
Joe's asked, why would you want the options there when you were sharing the dashboard? Why would you want nowhere if you are sharing a link? What might the use case be for selecting nowhere if you're going to share it?
If you're going to share it, then you probably don't want it on nowhere. But if you decide that that data shouldn't be visible anymore, you can't take back the link. You've already sent it to people. You can disable it. So if the dashboard changes and it shows something sensitive, for example, you can store a lot of data in Learning Lockers. There is the potential for storing sensitive data. Then you can revoke it. It's just to give you some control over it.
Thank you, Andrew. That makes sense to me, and Joe's echoed the same as well. Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it for dashboards. They're pretty easy to adjust. Just drag things around, and they'll bump out of the way. Get a little preview of where they're going to go. Yeah, compose them as you like.
Yeah, it's always struck me, Andrew, that with dashboards, that they are, even I can create a dashboard. It is simply click the add button, give it a name, and there's your dashboard, and you drag the widgets in. Of course, like with most things, the devil's in the detail. You need to have built the visualizations in the first place, which in my opinion is a bit more involved. You need to have had a thought about what information you're actually trying to display and why. And of course, that's a bit more involved. So everything running up to the actual creation of the dashboard, I think, in my opinion and my experience, takes a bit more effort. But the actual creating the dashboard is incredibly simple. Even I can do it, as I've said. And Joe's laughing, saying she's true. She's seen you do that.
Yeah, making the visualizations is the hard bit. Or making a visualization that makes sense with the data that you have is the hard bit.
That's very true. Brian's asking a question here. Is there the opportunity to put a label on a dashboard? Brian, when you say label, do you mean give it a title or do you mean something more than... Yes, it's just up there now. You can see sales dashboard, just top left-hand corner-ish of the screen. So you can imagine now, if you had multiple dashboards, sales dashboard, finance dashboard, LMS dashboard, MOOC dashboard, Andrew's doing one for you right now. So that's where you would give you called it a label, but yeah, you'd give it a title, a label, a name, and you can now see them all appearing. Although they're all nearly all blank, you can see them now being added to the top of the screen there. And every time Andrew would click on one of those, it would be a new dashboard, but they'd all be displayed next to one another.
And you can give titles to your widgets as well. Yeah.
Good point. Yes, when Andrew dropped the widgets in, they were just the widgets. You know, he knew what they were, but of course, to somebody that hasn't built the dashboard or hasn't built the visualizations, it would be incredibly useful to give them a title, just as Andrew's doing now. You can see him doing that. So I'm going to mute my microphone, but I'm going to turn it over to you guys, Andrew, Brian, Joe, Robert, Sebastian. Is there anything that Andrew's covered there that you want to pull apart a little bit more? You've got any questions about? Is there anything for those of you that perhaps haven't got the background to this, and that's absolutely fine? Is there anything where you need perhaps a bit of context setting because you've missed out previously. That's what the chat panel's there for. If you've got any questions, please do feel free to drop them in there. Okay, so it looks like Joe and Robert and Brian and Andrew, all good for them, no questions. Andrew said it looks pretty straightforward. It absolutely is at this point, Andrew, but I'd certainly agree that the part before this takes it's a bit more of a cognitive strain on my old brain. As Sebastian's saying, great. Thank you for that screen share, Andrew. I'm just going to swap out this screen layout once more. Please don't think that that was the end of your opportunity to ask questions. If you've got anything else, the chat panel is still there. I'm still monitoring it. If anything comes to mind in the next few minutes, feel free to drop it in there. What I'm going to ask you to do, just to get you to reflect on what we've just covered, but it's also interesting for Andrew and I, if I could ask you to click on the T symbol that is in the left-hand menu bar of your screen. It's a vertical menu bar. If you could click on there, and then click on the whiteboard and just let me know what your key takeaway or takeaways were from today's session. That would be incredibly useful. Thank you, Joe, for getting in there so quickly. I appreciate that. Whilst everybody's doing that, I'm just going to drag a few things onto the screen that you may find useful. I've just dropped in some files that may interest you. One of them is a HT2 Labs overview document, and the other one, probably of more interest to you right now, it's the Learning Technology Manager's Guide to xAPI. And the second thing I've just dragged on the screen are some links that may be of interest to you. Unsurprisingly, our Help Centre for Learning Locker is one of them, but there are also a few other resources and Help Centre articles and blog posts that we've written that relate to today's session that I've also dragged on the screen as well. Feel free to click on any of those and they'll open up in a new tab. If you click on any of the files, you'll be prompted to download them locally. There's nothing weird or wonderful, any dark art to accessing any of those links. Widgets and dashboards are relatively easy to set up in Learning Locker. I just have to get busy. With it. Indeed, yes, just finding the time to do it. Joe's saying that lots of choices, options, and different ways to slice and dice the data and present it to people. I'm really glad you spotted that, Joe, about all the different options. You mentioned it quite early on in the webinar, in the chat panel. Really pleased to see that although I think it's probably only the second time you've ever looked behind the scene of Learning Locker, you've been able to see all of those options. And of course, there was a heck of a lot more. Andrew just showed what he needed to show to achieve what he wanted today. There's a damn sight more. I now understand that creating dashboards is the easy part. Building meaningful widgets is more crucial. Yeah, the visualizations that sit in those widgets is, of course, that's the important thing. The dashboard, whilst incredibly useful, it's just somewhere to put the useful information. You need the useful information to begin with. That's great. So I'm going to be staying around here. It's 2:25 at the moment. Andrew's got nothing else to cover off. We're still here if you've got any questions or want to raise anything. I'm going to hang around now until just gone, 14:30, so about another 5 or 6 minutes. If you don't have anything to ask, if you're spent, if you're done, if you're happy with today's session, feel free to click in that top left-hand corner on the meeting button, and then you'll then have an option to leave the session. Before you do, though, a really big thank you from Andrew and I for logging in today and getting involved. Andrew, Brian's up to his next meeting. You're very welcome, Brian. Always a pleasure to see you here. And thanks for attending them all so regularly. Thank you. You're very welcome, Joe. Thank you. No problems, Andrew. You always know where we are. Thank you for joining in. You're welcome, Sebastian. And thank you for your time for getting involved, Robert.